Welcome. Welcome to this session on navigating cities through the energy transition. The world is at a critical juncture. Never before has there been a moment where businesses, energy consumers, and governments, from Canada to China, are aligning on a common vision: a road to net zero emissions. This vision presents daunting challenges, but it also offers extraordinary opportunities for collaboration to bring about change. Cities cover 3% of the Earth's surface, yet emit over 70% of all carbon emissions. Therefore, it is at cities where the need for integrated energy solutions, backed by ambitious policy and urban planning, will be critical if the world is to move towards net zero emissions in the years ahead. In my role leading Shell City Solutions globally, our mission is to help cities navigate energy transition through integrated urban solutions. Thus, the topic of today's session is very close to my heart. It is my honor and privilege to be hosting this co-visioning session with our esteemed panelists from all over the world, whom I would like to now introduce. With me is Lauren Sorkin, Executive Director of the Resilient Cities Network. And with us virtually is Aziza Akhmouch, Head of the Cities, Urban Policies and Sustainable Development Division at OECD, and Fred Akerboom, Manager Sustainability, City of Rotterdam. Our panelists are available to answer your questions online, so please submit them via the Q&A tool on your screen. So let's start the discussion. Resilience is ever so important now that we're facing the global challenge of climate change. What role does cities play? And how do we help them build resilience while navigating the energy transition? I'd like to first start the topic with Aziza. Aziza, thank you for dialing in from Paris on behalf of the OECD. What, in your view, is the role of cities?
Thank you very much, Emily, and congratulations on organizing this very interesting debate today. Cities are actually essential, as you rightly said, for that transition to a low-carbon economy, not only because they are discharging critical public policies at the local level that are at the center of the decarbonization of our cities, from regulating and managing land use all the way through housing, a number of energy efficiency related sectors, including clean forms of urban mobility, drinking water and sanitation, and so on, but also because they're actually responsible for, at least in the OECD countries, the 38 most advanced economies of the world, for a large share of the public investment and spending that goes to climate and environmental areas. 64% of that public investment is discharged by local and regional governments in OECD countries. And that means, therefore, they have both the stick and the carrot. They're where most people actually work and live, and they're essential to make that transition happen. I'd like to pick one example, which for the OECD has gained a lot of traction over the past few weeks in terms of what cities can do beyond their traditional interventions in fields such as transport, housing, and resource efficiency at large. And that is the example of buildings. We know that buildings account for almost a third of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions globally. And we also know that that share can actually reach 70% in cities like London, Tokyo, and New York. And in a recent report we've produced with the Coalition of Urban Transitions, we've seen that 80%, actually almost 90% of urban emissions can be eliminated by 2050 using technically feasible and widely available measures. And these significant emissions reductions comes primarily from the building sector. almost 60% of it. And that means, therefore, that decarbonizing our buildings is likely to generate multiple benefits, including in terms of jobs, health benefits, and increased energy affordability. So it's not just an environmental case for it, it's actually an economic and social case. And this is probably the reason why in many recovery packages, whether it's at the EU level or in countries like Spain, France, and many others in the OECD countries, national governments' recovery packages have actually devoted a big attention to that issue of decarbonization in buildings. And they've done so really putting on the spotlight local governments, because first, they're the owners of a large share of such buildings. In France, it's about 20% of non-residential building stock being owned by cities and regions. And that means they have levers in terms of public procurement, awareness raising, experimentation as well for using new technologies and skills development of local firms. Second, because these cities and regions are of course responsible for a number of building and zoning regulations, they can develop very ambitious regulations to boost that decarbonization, not only in new constructions, but also and most importantly in the existing buildings. And we've seen, for example, how cities like New York have introduced a very ambitious climate mobilization act that is actually capping the carbon emissions from large existing buildings. Third, we also know that cities and regions are actually very close to citizens and local businesses, and they can therefore engage these stakeholders to coordinate the dispersed innovation and renovation needs, including in particular in terms of social housing, and to bring in private investment into the local renovation market. And fourth, but not least, local governments are actually much better equipped to understand the local specifics of the building stock characteristics, the resulting energy consumption that we know is varying a lot across and within cities, and that can therefore develop a very tailored and strategic approach to that decarbonization conversation. So you need that whole of government perspective, which is why at the OECD we've been actually working on a full-fledged program on building energy efficiency in cities and regions to produce, the data, the evidence, the dialogue, and the tailored recommendations that can accelerate that transition.
Thank you, Aziza. Thanks for that. Cities certainly play a key role, and especially in the building sector, and they also play a key role in regulations and convening the various city stakeholders. Now I'd like to move to an example from a city, and I'd like to ask Fred from the city of Rotterdam. Fred, thank you for joining us today to showcase what the city of Rotterdam is doing in energy transition. What is the role of the city in decarbonization?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Aziza, and thank you, Emily, for this introduction. Well, I think, as Aziza told, our role as a city government is very, very important. Well, let me explain some things that are happening in the city of Rotterdam. Rotterdam is the second city in the Netherlands, some 600,000 inhabitants. We have a large harbor, the largest in Europe. So it could be easy to reduce CO2 just by looking at the harbor. Well, we also looking at the harbor, but we think that the mobility, the housing, etc., is very, very important. So everything in the city, every individual, every company has to join the energy transition. Well, let me introduce. Let me see three actions that we are doing. Well, first of all, we try to be a fossil-free city. And so we have complied to the 49% of CO2 emission reduction by 2030 and be a climate neutral city in 2050. So, well, how do we get fossil-free? Of course, like Aziza told, especially the existing houses, making them more insulated. That's one. And second, using a fossil-free district heating system and using and promoting geothermal heat and cooling, and also from our waters, etc. And instead, less burning of natural gas and less using air conditions, etc. But as Aziza told, it's an enormous task, not only for the government itself, but also for the people living there, and for the housing companies, because it's financial, very expensive. It's infrastructural, an enormous challenge, and it's also social because we get into the houses of all the people, of all the companies, etc. So our challenge is to make energy transition explainable. Everyone has to understand why we do it and how we do it, to make it achievable, and to make it payable, affordable for all the people in our city. And that's quite a challenge we have. So that's also why we very much like to work together with other companies and together with other cities in the world. Well, our second challenge is to make enough clean energy to accomplish this task. As I earlier mentioned, we have new sources for cooling and heating, and for instance, the new hydrogen plant of Shell in our harbor could afford a lot of sustainable heat for our city. But there's more. We have some 19 square kilometers of flat roofs. We use them to put solar PV on them, and also greening the roofs, of course, because we like to cool the city as much as possible. And of course, we invest in wind power, in solar, etc. And we try to, and our target is that all our inhabitants can have a share in the revenues of all those new and sustainable energy forms. At least half of all the energy has to be part of our societies, and we use local energy corporations to make this all happen. Well, and the last I would emphasize is that we call it sustainability by design. So every sustainability should be part of every plan, of every person, of every measure the city takes, of every building the city makes. Like Aziza told, we have some 25,000 buildings ourselves, so there's quite a task. And it's not about CO2 itself only. It's also about circular climate adaptive actions, and it's about enhancing biodiversity. In a broad sense, focusing on resilience for the future. Well, that's and like Aziza told, we see sustainability as a chance, as an opportunity for the future, for making our city more livable, but also to achieve a lot of work for our city and making more green, more cool, more nice to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for sharing on the many different energy solutions you're exploring with your citizens and also some of the challenges you face. I really like the part about sustainability by design, how you're tapping on sustainability as an opportunity and also to create circularity from there. Aziza, what are your reflections on this?
I think what is happening in Rotterdam is extremely interesting because there is on the one hand the push towards advancing the greening agenda, but there's also on the other hand the attention that is paid on the vulnerable groups, or let's say making sure that that transition is actually just, and that we know that environmental policies are actually some of the policies that bear most of the distributional effects on people, and making sure that that transition is happening but remains just is at the core of the city. And I think that's also one of the reasons why the very mayor of Rotterdam, Mayor Abu Taleb, is part of the OECD Champion Mayors Initiative for Inclusive Growth, because the core function of that coalition is really to tackle inequality and to make sure that the capacity of cities to face mega trends such as climate or urbanization or digitalization and so on also goes hand in hand with their capacity to mitigate inequality, or at least to share better the dividends of prosperity with their urban dwellers. So I think that's a very interesting example of how you combine actually both priorities. Having Rotterdam in mind, and having worked at the OECD with over 50 cities on this green agenda over the past 2 years in particular, looking at how they're transitioning to a circular economy, I think there are a few messages that are quite striking today and that the pandemic has probably exacerbated. The first one is that there's probably a window today where planets are more aligned. The combination of the Zoom effect that has triggered many rethinkings of new urban paradigms in terms of how we go and work, how we live, how we produce, how we consume, with the pre-existing Greta effect that was already there before basically the pandemic, have probably made a number of solutions to transition to a low carbon economy today way more acceptable politically and socially than they were just 2 years ago. I mean, if you remember the massive resistance we had in Paris and many other cities across the world to the political will to reduce the weight of cars in large, dense agglomeration areas and to drive more cycling, for example. I mean, today everybody is going in this direction. That was not a given just a few years back. So there is a momentum, and I think that's a very a good piece of news. There's also a second piece of news, which is that many governments now are way more conducive, supportive to this transition to a circular economy, either through recovery packages to make sure that there is a good combination of natural and technological loops, and that there's actually a set of incentives to create projects and profitable investments that cities can embrace with that circular economy transition, and at the EU level as part of the Green Deal in particular. But there's also, and that's equally important, a bottom-up pressure from many citizens that want to make sure that there is no return to normal on a number of fronts. And I think issues related to revisiting proximity, local loops, bringing more nature into cities, and bringing also maybe more enterprises into farms, show the extent to which, and probably that's in addition to the earlier question, the functional scale at which that environmental transition is going to happen is not only or not any longer the core administrative perimeter of the city government capacity, but basically the functional area where people work and live. And that means we need a much stronger connection between rural and urban constituencies in the way we drive that transition locally. And I think this is one of the things that the circular economy can do. It can really accelerate these rural-urban linkages in driving that culture of sustainable production and consumption, in making sure that there is a long-term vision that can be established for urban and rural policy to reduce waste, to increase resource efficiency, to keep resources in use as long as possible, and also to transform waste into resources. And I think that scale is slightly changing today, and is really lending itself not only to more intermunicipal cooperation and even more regional in the sense of the second tier of government cooperation, but it also giving a role to the national governments to drive that partnerships at the very local level. So the city government, the mayor, has an essential role to play, but it has to be in connection with the surroundings and the hinterland. And I think maybe if there is one thing that this crisis has shown is the range of possibilities for more synergies and complementarities between different territories, whether they're urban, rural, semi-dense, so that it's not just a zero-sum logics whereby cities get it all and rural areas absorb all the costs, or the other way around, but it's really a win-win partnership. And the circular economy can drive really that functional approach to the green transition.
Thank you, Aziza. The COVID-19 pandemic has certainly thrown us into unprecedented times with new ways of living and working. And recovery remains a very top priority for many cities. The examples you gave on how decarbonization remains an opportunity, and sometimes even a greater opportunity now, is really heartening. And we have seen how the global pandemic, coupled with extreme climate events in the last few months globally, has strengthened the need for resilience to be built up in cities. So now I'd like to move to expert in this area, to Lauren, who is in the room today. Thanks for being in the room with us today. So the Resilient Cities Network helps cities to build resilience all over the world. The recent example of Houston also highlights the need for energy resilience. How do you see decarbonization fitting in?
Thank you for the question, Emily, and it's great to be here with you and with Aziza and Fred also, though they're remote, to be part of this excellent panel, and congratulations on organizing it. I think we're all in violent agreement that there couldn't be a more important time to really work towards energy transitions, and that cities need to be leading the way in that transition. So emphasizing what we know, right? 2/3 of the emissions are coming from cities, and decarbonizing our cities, the way they're built and powered, is essentially going to enable us to build resilience. So when we decarbonize, right, we help to keep the natural environment in balance, which is going to slow down the intensity of things like storms and floods, so typhoons and the kinds of hurricanes that we saw hitting Houston, and I'll speak about that later, and also decreasing things like extreme heat over time. So it helps us to build resilience in that way. And then, as we've heard Aziza say and Fred say, with inclusive economy, right, when we change the way cities are being powered and being built, it gives us the opportunity to create jobs. Some call them green jobs, but they can be jobs in energy systems, new waste systems. They can be jobs in creating better natural defenses. And so we really get this opportunity to decarbonize cities that drives multiple benefits for the economy. And that's really what I want to explain further, because in essence, resilience is very practical. Resilience, it might sound like an esoteric term, but it's actually about designing solutions with multiple benefits to ensure that the investments we make today are actually going to deliver for people, they're going to deliver for the economy, and they're going to deliver for the natural environment. And so, just to name a few, when we make an investment, let's say in changing the source of energy, we could improve air quality, we can also create new jobs, and we can also restore the natural environment. So we see that also at this time with resilience, it is absolutely a team sport. And I think we've heard Fred speak to this, and we've heard Aziza speak to it as well, right? It's something that goes beyond what cities and local governments can do alone. And that's why it's so great to have the private sector convening a discussion where you have policy think tanks, cities, civil society sitting together, and essentially we have the same outcome in mind, right? Which is an equitable and just future that's more sustainable. So, in this highly digitized and electricity-dependent society, right, one of those most important common goals that we have to work on together is electrification, right, of our cities. And that's a very exciting thing to do together. Also to look at really critical sectors that build resilience, like transportation and housing and industry that surrounds and enables our cities. And, we've heard, and, directly from local government as well as from Aziza, that, government really has this critical role to play in convening. And that's really where you get this nexus of decarbonizing and resilience, right? In asking those questions of that larger group coming together to answer them. So Houston is an example of a city that is very much on the front lines, right, of energy transition as the energy capital of the United States, where I'm from, but also in responding with urban resilience. So, as we saw, and as I think most folks know, Houston is no stranger to climate impacts, right? First, with Hurricane Harvey, they say that the storm was estimated to be about 4 times stronger than it could have been because of climate change, because of how much warmer the waters are and how much stronger that storm was. And so that combined with what we saw this past January with the winter storm Uri was really quite tragic, because the city systems broke down, and the failure of the energy grid there in Houston meant that people couldn't heat their homes. And in some cases, very sad cases, people actually couldn't survive. And so, the lesson that Mayor Sylvester Turner, who is the chairman of our board of directors, and the leadership team and our chief resilience officer of Houston really took from that was that, there is this really important opportunity to redouble efforts to strengthen those energy systems and to achieve those multiple benefits through urban resilience. And in the few years that have followed Hurricane Harvey, a lot of this kind of work was already underway in terms of the energy transition, and now it is being strengthened through a couple of different means. So Houston has a carbon reduction strategy, which they have a report called the Low Energy Capital, and that looks at a few different pathways for energy transition for Houston, advancing carbon capture and storage, building a low carbon energy grid, developing Houston as a hydrogen hub, and I know Fred was already talking about hydrogen in the port in Rotterdam, and also creating a circular plastics economy. And now on top of that, Houston has added to these efforts by chairing a resilience and racial equity community of practice within Resilient Cities Network to ensure that the work and their investments that they're doing are really benefiting all people in a way that creates an inclusive economy across all different groups in the city. And they are chairing that group for all of the North American cities in our network, and they're going to be opening that up internationally. And finally, I would share that Houston's example is a powerful one, but it's not isolated. Resilient Cities Network has been working with cities for more than 7 years, more than 100 cities together. And we see that the more cities work together, the more alike they can find themselves, and the better they can share good practices. And so it's through these deep and trusting relationships that we can accelerate the pace of change and scale up. Just this past Earth Day, Mayor Sylvester Turner launched the Mayor's Agenda. He was supported by Mayor Abu Taleb and other mayors within our network in doing this. And he is calling out to cities across our network to put forward their projects and infrastructure that are climate ready and will create green jobs. Because we know that cities are ready and they have projects and they need partners to come together to prepare those projects. So one of the cities who is, as I mentioned, collaborating very closely with Houston is the city of Rotterdam. So, Fred, I would turn the word back to you as a city representative and ask, how this urban resilience and decarbonization agenda continues to come together in Rotterdam, and how your work with the private sector continues to accelerate.
Thank you. Well, thanks for all the compliments from the city of Houston. Well, we collaborate. We work together very much, and I think that's great because we are a water city from I think the 17th century, whatever. But we can still learn a lot also from Houston and other cities. So it's very important to have this network working, and our major is of course very much involved in this project. So thank you. Well, but what I say that we're working on, we call it sustainability by design. So it's important that mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, etc., will come together as much as possible. Well, and it's on all scales. We work on local scale, we work on government scale, the countryside, etc., but also with you. But it's also important for our inhabitants. For example, and that's very small, etc., but it helps. We have a subsidy for people to get their flagstones out of their gardens, so that the people themselves think about what resilience is and what adaptive can do for the garden, etc. So it really helps to get all those levels, all those, not only companies but also the people themselves. So all those. And the work together with companies is of course very important because the role of government has been changed the last decades. Of course, people won't listen only to the government. They won't. We know what people want, but they only accept the advice from their neighbor or whatever, or their neighborhood, etc. So what we try to do is, of course, to help them get the information, etc., and to work together as a neighborhood, to work together with our neighbors to get things done on mitigation or adaptation, whatever. But also the companies like Shell are very important, because we, as government, we can only make the demand of our people, of our industries, etc., but we can't. The supply has to come from the companies themselves. So we can make a strategy of hydrogen like you did in Houston, but companies like Shell, etc., have to invest in hydrogen itself. So it's very important to have those. So we talk a lot. We work together with a lot of companies on the strategic level, because where do we want to be together with those companies in the future, but also in projects. So like I told, like hydrogen, but also we build a new football stadium with a lot of solar PV on roof of it. So and that solar PV will be used by the people who are living in the neighborhood. So it's all levels, the strategic, the people, etc. So it's very important to have those companies near you and have them join in the energy strategy, and because it's so complex. Like Aziza told, it's really, and it's for the people themselves. I mean, it sounds also easy just to have another kind of heat source as a housing or whatever, but it's very it could be very stressful also, because we have to get into their houses to make new pipes in their houses, to have a new bill, etc. And it needs a lot of trust and a lot of information and a lot of money, of course. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. I absolutely agree that the role of the community and companies is indispensable in making things work. And certainly the role of the government in helping to promote low carbon fuels like hydrogen, and therefore creating the demand, is crucial. And corporate citizens like Shell have to play our part in investing into renewables generation as well as in cleaner fuels. I think just this month we've announced the investment in the northern part of the Netherlands, in Groningen, in a hydrogen refilling station for buses, which we will supply with green hydrogen. So that's an example of how the city can work with the private sector like Shell to really make system-level changes and enable this decarbonization. So I'd like to expand further on the role of the private sector and the community. Aziza, what are your thoughts on their roles?
I very much subscribe to what Fred said, and actually I have two takeaways from his intervention. The first one in relation to trust, and the second one in relation to the varying roles of cities. I think what Fred said about the trust relationship between citizens and their governments is absolutely true. Actually, we've seen since the global financial crisis that in the OECD region, a good 70% of citizens have limited trust in the capacity of their national government to ensure their well-being. But what we see, and that is equally interesting, is that it's the other way around when you go local. You have actually a much higher share of local residents that trust the capacity of their local governments, and in particular, the city leadership, the mayor, to ensure their well-being, way more than at the national level. And I think that strengthens even more the earlier point that was made about local governments. The second point that I take from Fred's intervention is that somehow cities have different roles to enable that transition. Sometimes they will act as a facilitator. Sometimes they will act as an enabler. Sometimes they will act as a promoter of that transition to a circular economy, and that much of this actually depends on their level of maturity with that conversation, on the level of buy-in of their residents. And we saw, for example, in a survey we did across 50 cities that were embarking on the journey of a circular economy, that only 10% actually were pretty front runners and advanced and had already put in place the framework conditions. Most of them were really incipient in that conversation. And I think that brings the private sector into the conversation, because many of us at the OECD, our job is really to advise national governments on how to develop and implement better policies for better lives. Many of us are actually deeply convinced that governance is not only about governments, and that a lot of the radical transformations that are needed to fit for the future rely extensively on the private sector contribution and stakeholder engagement at large. And in that very same survey across 50 cities transitioning to the circular economy, we saw that 80% of them were reporting working with and engaging business in that transformation agenda that they were driving. And we know that strategies for material reuse, for example, can bring about a value of 85 million euros per year within the construction sector only, and more than 150 million euros per year with more efficient organic residual streams. So the main message there is that the private sector is no longer approached only to pour, let's say, commercial sources of finance or bring investment. The private sector is being approached and also acting in terms of the new forms of collaborations across the value chains, mainstreaming this sustainability agenda in their very business model. This is what can make a difference, and make a difference with the repackaging or maybe old paradigm of corporate social responsibility, all the ESG conversation. And what we see of front-runner companies is really when they revisit completely their supply chains and their business models and their contractual models to make sure that they're agile enough to fit with these new constraints. And we've seen examples in the building sector, of course, linking designers to design modular buildings that can be reused, to avoid, of course, the use of new material, but also constructors to make an efficient use of material, including those that are recyclable, and households to increase, for example, water and energy or water efficiency, and of course the city itself to make sure that this is happening from a regulatory and financial standpoint. So I think you need that triangle between people, places, and firms, and the business at large, whether it's large multinational companies, but also small and mid-sized companies that we know are the backbone of the economy, to really incorporate that transition lens in their very contractual model, procurement initiatives, and let's say supply chains, so that that shared responsibility can actually happen on the ground.
Thank you, Aziza. Lauren, what are your thoughts?
I mean, there's so much to pick up on from both what Fred said and what Aziza said there, Emily. It is so essential that local government, the private sector, and national governments and finance come together around these issues, right? And I think this dialogue that Aziza was just talking about, creating these forums is so important. And essentially, whatever the issue that we're trying to get at, there are really three things that we can do together, right, as we create these dialogues. First is, agreeing on what the data is, what's the baseline, right? What is it that we're trying to solve? And I think that in her remarks, Aziza shared some of these, potentials, right? That are these high-level potentials that we know are there, whether it's energy transition, circular economy. And then inherently, we have to come down and localize them, right? And we have to have those targets. And in many cases, those targets are being provided at an international level by national governments in a process. And now, increasingly, we are seeing that they are being taken up by the private sector, right? These commitments to decarbonizing to 1.5 degrees come to companies too. And then at the city level, right, we have this important opportunity to localize that. And so absolutely sharing that data and then articulating what are our strategies for achieving decarbonization and resilience, naming those and then designing those outcomes between the private sector and the public sector locally is key, and then mobilizing the right kind of finance to back them up. And I think that this is where the work is now. I think that we absolutely know what we need to do, right, in this moment. The high-level statistics are very, very clear. And there aren't 2 days that go by without a major company, corporation, financier announcing a new target. So it's a thrilling time to be in the energy transition. Now the work is to localize that and to keep people involved, to make sure that those investments that we make do not leave people behind. And that's where I think, the work that's going on in Rotterdam is so absolutely key, because it has this inclusivity lens, right, that Mayor Abu Talib, that Fred, that Arnaud and the team have been driving forward now and can speed it up. And that's what's so powerful about this moment and exciting about working on it from a network perspective. So for us, we're excited because this is a time where we can take this practice and we can really step it up and work with partners to really scale the change.
Thank you, Lauren. I represent the private sector in this room, so I'd like to say that Shell is committed to playing our part. We aim to be a net zero emissions company by reducing the emissions from our operations, as well as partnering our customers to reduce the emissions from fuels and other energy products that we sell. Shell is also investing in renewables generation, in hydrogen, as well as electric vehicle charging networks, and many more low-carbon energy solutions. We want to play our part in advancing sustainable solutions for cities. From the panel discussion, it's clear that we have a long journey ahead of us, and there's so much at stake. And collaboration and partnership between the various city stakeholders, the government, the private sector, and the community will be very, very important for us to create sustainable cities of the future. I'd like to give my heartfelt thanks to the panelists for taking time to join us today. I think we're all on the same mission, and it's great to have such a wonderful dialogue, and I really look forward to future dialogue and collaboration on these areas. Now we'd like to move to the final part of this session. Together with Lauren, we are most pleased to announce a strategic collaboration between the Resilient Cities Network and Shell City Solutions. As cities grow, the need to build resilience while navigating the energy transition becomes increasingly important. At Shell City Solutions, our mission is to navigate the energy transition through integrated urban solutions. We are pleased to partner with the Resilient Cities Network, which has a wealth of experience and research in helping cities to improve resilience. Together, we are proud to launch the Resilient Energy and Mobility Transition Program, where we build collaborative platforms that help cities to accelerate their transition in decarbonization and resilience. We look forward to welcoming member cities from the network into the program in the coming weeks. Now I'd like to pass to Lauren to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Emily. We at the Resilient Cities Network are thrilled to be partnering with Shell, a company that is truly at the nexus of this transition from traditional supply and demand. We know that we are at a time when energy companies are under increasing scrutiny to change. Historically, these companies have profited tremendously in providing the supply to economies that have had growing demand. Now, bringing that demand and expertise together with what we know we need to do in terms of the energy transition gives us an incredible opportunity to position ourselves for a sustainable future. We at the Resilient Cities Network are committed to creating a safe and equitable future for the 220 million people in our cities around the world. Our city's proven approach positions communities and people at the center to ensure that investments that are made have equitable outcomes. Partnering with Shell gives us an opportunity to work on projects that will truly drive a green and just recovery. We know that our cities concentrate both challenges and opportunities, and together we can really catalyze solutions that will meet the energy and climate crises that may emerge on the horizon. We are so excited to develop this partnership with you.
Thank you, Lauren. As we can't shake hands at this point of time, we're going to do a fist bump to seal this collaboration.
Here we go.
Here you go. Thank you. Look forward to a most successful collaboration.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. I hope you found this session engaging and fruitful. Please feel free to reach out to us to explore further collaboration opportunities. We'll end with a short video. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.